mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings. Joining me once again is Jay Anglin, our Great Lakes Migration Editor for Waterfowl 360. Jay, what's going on, man?
Oh, just preparing for this blizzard that's going to strike the Western Great Lakes and much of the country. It looks like cold, just brutal cold. So kind of batting down the hatches up here, getting out in front of it. Yeah,
and Jay is headquartered there out of northern Indiana and, hunts Michigan, Indiana, Illinois. I think he mentioned he was in southern Indiana a little bit. Wanted to get him on the phone here because that is the topic of conversation across, much of the country. I mean, it is about to get cold. We have a major weather system coming in. Lots of chatter definitely around here at national headquarters in Memphis. People are getting a little fired up to see that cold weather and snow hitting some of the northern and mid-latitude states. And then it's even going to be brutally cold down here in the south where we are, which we're a little unaccustomed to. But as far as it goes for you, Jay, what are you hearing? I think when I talked to you earlier, you mentioned something about, Wisconsin still had a bunch of birds and Michigan, and a lot of those places are going to empty out, right?
Oh, I think a lot of the birds you see in those states are, they're going to hang on as long as they can. If they have moving water, let's say a power plant, discharge that keeps the water from freezing. I always say those are our winter birds. And, southern Wisconsin and Michigan and northern Ohio, these places, northern Indiana, northern Illinois, we have those birds, especially the urban birds that find those little nooks and crannies that stay open. But, for the most part, if you're a mallard or a Canada goose out in rural Indiana or southern Michigan, and we're supposed to, they just upgraded our forecast. I mean, we're pushing where I live 30 inches by the weekend, if you count lake effect and system snow. So that's clearly going to move a lot of birds. I think also we still have a few, there's gadwall here and there. I've seen a few green wings here and there, widgeon. I was kind of stunned how many people are still seeing widgeon around here still. At this stage, it's pretty unusual. All those birds are definitely going to go bye-bye, if not, right before the storm. I mean, right now, they should be heading out. It's cold right now, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and I was just hunting in central Indiana last weekend, and we shot gadwall, widgeon, mallards, of course. But I was surprised to see the widgeon. But with this storm system, all those wetland feeding species, your green wings, gadwalls, widgeon, those things are gone. They're not going to have anywhere to hang around up there. So, and I think the big question here is, where are these birds going to end up? I mean, it's going to be 6 degrees here in Memphis on Friday. So I think a lot of people are really looking at some big water. Mississippi River is going to come into play here. And I'm sure, those with, boats and access up north of us here, they're going to be doing the same thing. I know my buddies there in Indiana are looking at the Wabash River Valley. Illinois River is going to come into play, probably a little more. What are you hearing up there in Illinois?
Well, Illinois, is way below right now in terms of like the Illinois River Valley and Mississippi River Valley, which, are, of course, I harp on it all the time about how they draw so many birds through there. But as of last survey last week by the guys, the folks at Forbes over there, they're way below average. So really, those birds have been, it's been a stronghold throughout the season. So, there's a food deficit at this point. And now you're going to throw in ice. Forget about it. They're going to lose a ton of birds. So birds that are forced to roll on down and are, the birds that just hug the ice line, the snow line, they're going to have those birds bounce down maybe out of Minnesota and Wisconsin. Over here, it's the big river valleys. You already mentioned the Wabash. Of course, I talked to you. I was down there yesterday, kind of hunting that Wabash River Valley. And man, it was already loading up because the last time we talked, I talked about how I felt like there was going to be a big push. And you mentioned you were going down there or up there for you, down there for me. And I said, boy, you're hitting it right on the nose. And really you did, because that was a big wave of birds right there. And honestly, I think a lot of the birds that this system that's coming in would have normally pushed out, they've already gone down. So the thing that you mentioned also, this remarkable broad range, frigid, single digit temperature, it's kind of unprecedented in a lot of ways. Birds that are pushing to find open water, they're probably going to find about the same thing further south. So, who knows how smart they are in those little brains of theirs. They might figure out a place that they might just decide, you know what, there's no point in migrating. We could just stay here and live in this little puddle for a few days. So it's hard. It's really kind of hard telling what's going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's a total crapshoot, You never know. Obviously, we don't know, exactly where, these birds are necessarily going. You can't pinpoint it. But yeah, I mean, we did a Louisiana migration alert, and, Louisiana has a lot of birds right now, or significantly more than they had in November, which is good. But, they're going to pick up ducks too. But I was just kind of looking at their forecast, and northern Louisiana is going to be, frigid, for them, in the teens and all the way down to the coast. Looks like it could be in the 20s, low 30s, potential freeze in some of those ponds. Like you said, you just don't really know where these things are going to end up. More than likely, a lot of these, the birds that are getting pushed out of the Great Lakes region are going to follow these major river corridors and at least have some open water to hang out in. Have you heard anything out of Ohio?
Yeah, so Ohio, it's kind of funny. We talked about Ohio the last time, and a lot of that you kind of have to read between the lines sometimes. But at this point, I think you can be pretty confident that they're going to have a lot of ice issues in those big key areas along the Lake Erie coast, and that from one end to the other. And really, that has been kind of the stronghold as usual. And so, Lake St. Clair in Michigan, Ontario, in Northwest Ohio, Lake Erie, that whole corridor, the Detroit River, the Maumee River, all those places, they're, traditionally hold birds in the winter. Those are going to definitely push birds out. There's just no way they can hang on with those kinds of temps. And the wind, you're going to have, a lot of wind agitation on these big waters will kind of keep the ice down, at least initially. But what'll happen is, and it happens on the rivers too, is you get pack ice and flow ice, and it starts to build up along the shoreline. And so, it forces birds to go out and seek areas out in open water offshore, which is great for the birds because they can go and ride away for a few days. But for hunters, it's pretty much impossible to target those birds. So, they kind of go into survival mode. And I think you might be able to find a couple of mallards on a drainage ditch eating watercress that's somewhere that's spring fed here in northern Indiana. But if you're the average duck, you're definitely going to be looking for those big water areas, as you mentioned, big river valleys, big open reservoirs with a good catch, starts fetching the wind, cross current that keeps the open water open. But just talking to a friend of mine that was muskie fishing yesterday on a big lake in northern Indiana here, they couldn't find any access to the lake because all the boat ramps were already frozen. So that kind of puts it in perspective. I mean, we're already really kind of starting out here with a big ice issue. So, yeah, I mean, it sounds like, that's going to be the story for a lot of those mid-latitude hunters. I know my buddies that are there in central Indiana are potentially even eyeballing doing some ice fishing next week. They're like, we could get some. Their season's still in for sure, but they're looking at some alternative activities when this thing really sets in. And I think that's the unprecedented nature of it, that cold weather goes all the way south. And one thing you did last week, you did a couple alerts in the Northeast. So you were kind of calling around. So do you have any updates up there in kind of New England? I know you talked to a couple sea duck guys, and you have a little update for that area. Yeah, so salt, of course, doesn't freeze like fresh water. So along those coastal areas, you have these coastal zones, and then you have these inland zones, Massachusetts and Connecticut and, et cetera. I mean, a lot of those places are coming towards the end of their season anyway. But really, they've been looking for ice, inland to drive birds to the coast. They already picked up a lot of their black ducks, in Canada's and sort of, your late season stronghold mallards and all that. I suspect that any of the, softer ducks, I call them soft ducks up here, but any of the other species, there's a few woodies probably bobbing around here and there, but those are going to skedaddle, and then everything else is just going to, pile into the coastline and the big river estuaries. And so the guys along the coast are already absolutely stacked with options on sea ducks, divers, Now you're going to throw in that puddle duck element. I would say life's going to be real good on the East Coast. And that could be said to some degree in some parts of the Great Lakes, maybe Lake Ontario. But again, it's the ability to access it. And of course, absolutely critical to mention the safety factor. Having had a real big mistake when I was in high school that almost cost me my life, my brother and I both. I cannot stress enough, if you decide to go out into this stuff with those temps, you have to be prepared. Of course, cell phones have made things a lot easier for us to get rescued, but it's just not worth it. And I mean, it sounds like the old guy on the porch, get off my lawn. But the bottom line is, it's not worth a couple ducks to go out and risk your life. So just use really, a ton of caution when planning these hunts out the next week to 10 days.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes up all throughout the country. I mean, when temperatures drop like this, it can get dangerous real quick. You hit that water and you're in big trouble. You better have a plan. So, and we've talked about that quite a bit on this podcast. Hopefully people kind of take it to heart for sure.
I think a lot of younger guys tend to kind of look over it, kind of gloss over it. And I don't mean that as an insult, but it's just they haven't been around long enough to realize how bad it can get. This is definitely one of those times. So.
Yeah, I mean, we've got all these, very shallow agricultural fields throughout the Mid-South, rice, these pumped up fields, and they're going to be out of business for about, 3, 4, maybe upwards of 5 days. They're going to be locked solid. So a lot of guys are already talking about, I've heard guys saying Arkansas River, a lot of people hunt the White River, although there's not a ton of water over there quite yet. Mississippi, I just had lunch with a guy who's like, yep, we're planning on hunting the Mississippi this weekend. And I'm like, okay, make sure you're prepared. You make sure you know what you're doing when you get out there, because it can go south pretty quick. Well, Jay, man, before I get you out of here, last question I always ask you, how is the fishing and what are you going to do when it gets this cold? Do you just lock it up and shut it down?
Well, it's interesting. I had a trip today that was postponed. I mean, we've been so spoiled with these warm falls that are, warm falls and early winters. And boy, it's awfully cold. It's 30. And I'm just laughing because 30 degrees in the big bad world of winter steelhead is like balmy. So fishing's still good. I mean, I've caught them in water that's almost liquid ice. And so, but yeah, I mean, how many people want to go out and stand in, 16 degrees and steelhead fish? I know I don't want to take people to do that. So, I kind of lock it down. I mean, I'll probably fish tomorrow, and then after that, I'm going to pack the boat away, wrap things up, and tighten up the cover, and wait for the thaw, a week or so out. But then we'll have water issues around here. So yeah, but fishing's good, man. I mean, it is what it is. It just got to roll with the punches.
Cool. It actually sounds really cold, you just describing that. So I'm just thinking, man, that sounds frigid standing out there fishing, but I'm sure it's awesome. Well, Jay, man, this has been great. Nice little update. I think people out there should start, making preparations for this cold weather. It's definitely, migration. The migration will be on. People keep their eyes peeled, and that pretty much goes all across the country. This is pretty widespread, and these cold, freezing temps are going to push all the way down to the coast, even deep into Texas. So be prepared for that. And Jay, you got anything else you want to leave them with?
No, just get out there and enjoy the holidays and get out there and just be safe.
Awesome. Hey, man, and you have a Merry Christmas.
You too.
I'd like to thank my guest, Jay Anglin, for coming on the show and sharing a little insight, kind of the mid-latitude states of the Great Lakes and Northeast, and sharing some migration information on just before this big storm hits. I'd like to thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for putting the show together, getting it out to you, and I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the DU podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks. Stay tuned to the ducks.